The stagecoach lurched to a bone-jarring halt outside Redemption Springs, Arizona Territory, and Catherine Brennan stumbled out into the unforgiving August heat of 1883. Her carefully packed traveling dress now the same burnt sienna as the desert floor, her face masked with a layer of grit so thick she could taste it between her teeth. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston to become the bride of a rancher named Walter Hemmings, a man she knew only through 3 carefully worded letters and 1 daguerreotype that showed a stern face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. And now she stood in this God-forsaken stretch of territory wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her 22 years. The other passengers hurried toward the dubious shade of the depot building, but Catherine remained frozen in the street, her single trunk at her feet, squinting against the brilliant sun that seemed determined to blind her, when she heard bootsteps approaching and a low voice that carried warmth despite the dust in her ears. "Ma'am, you look like you have been wrestling with the devil himself and came out the other side still standing." Catherine turned toward the voice and found herself looking up at a man who stood easily over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat but his eyes visible, a startling gray-green like sage after rain. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-weathered skin and a day's worth of stubble along his jaw, and he was looking at her with something that might have been amusement or admiration or both. "I feel as though I have been doing exactly that," Catherine said, reaching up to touch her face and feeling the grit beneath her gloved fingers. "I must look a fright." "You look like someone who just survived 3 days in a stagecoach across the territory," the man said, and then his expression shifted to something softer, almost reverent. "You wear the West like a queen." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun, and she found herself staring at this stranger, who had just offered her the most peculiar and oddly touching compliment she had ever received. Before she could formulate a response, another man emerged from the depot, this one older and thicker around the middle, his face florid beneath his hat. And Catherine recognized him immediately from the daguerreotype, despite the extra weight and the broken veins across his nose that spoke of too much whiskey and too little restraint. "Miss Brennan," Walter Hemmings said, his voice rough and impatient, "you are late. The stage was supposed to arrive 2 hours ago." "The stage encountered difficulties with a wheel outside of Tucson," Catherine said, forcing herself to speak politely despite the way her stomach had just dropped at the sight of her intended husband. "The driver managed repairs, but it cost us time." "Time is money in this country," Hemmings said, reaching for her trunk without so much as a proper greeting or welcome. "I have cattle to see to and cannot be standing around town all day waiting on delayed stages." The tall stranger had gone very still beside Catherine, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he had opinions about Hemmings's greeting, but was keeping them to himself. Catherine felt a wild urge to ask this stranger his name, to beg him to tell her she had not just committed herself to a life with a man who could not even manage basic courtesy. But Hemmings was already hauling her trunk toward a wagon hitched at the rail, and she had no choice but to follow. "Wait," the stranger said, and his hand came to rest lightly on Catherine's elbow, so briefly she might have imagined it except for the warmth that lingered even after he dropped his hand. "Miss Brennan, if you ever need anything at all, my name is James Cordell. I run the 6 Points Ranch about 5 miles north of Hemmings's place. You send word and I will come." Walter Hemmings had stopped and turned back, his expression darkening. "Cordell, you stay away from what is mine. Miss Brennan is here to be my wife, and I will thank you not to be putting ideas in her head." "I am putting nothing anywhere," James Cordell said, his voice level but with an edge that suggested danger beneath the calm surface. "I am merely extending the hospitality that any decent person extends to a newcomer in the territory, something you seem to have forgotten in your hurry to get back to your cattle." Catherine watched the two men face each other in the dusty street, tension crackling between them like heat lightning, and she understood with a sinking certainty that there was history here. Bad blood that had nothing to do with her but which she had just stepped into the middle of nonetheless. Hemmings broke the stare first, spitting into the dust and turning back to his wagon with muttered curses that Catherine pretended not to hear. "Come along, Miss Brennan," Hemmings called without looking back. "Daylight is burning and I have work waiting." Catherine allowed herself one more glance at James Cordell, finding him still standing exactly where she had left him, watching her with an expression she could not quite read, but which made her heart perform an uncomfortable acrobatic maneuver inside her chest. Then she turned and followed Hemmings to the wagon, climbing up onto the hard bench seat and arranging her filthy skirts as best she could, while Hemmings secured her trunk in the back. The ride to Hemmings's ranch took nearly an hour, and he spent the first half of it in silence, guiding the horses along a rutted track that wound through scrubland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Catherine tried to appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape, so different from the green abundance of Massachusetts, but all she could think about was the contrast between Hemmings's brusque dismissal and James Cordell's unexpected gallantry, and the way Cordell had looked at her as though she were something precious rather than an inconvenience. "You will find ranch life different from what you are accustomed to in the East," Hemmings said finally, breaking the silence without preamble. "I need a woman who can work, not one who will spend her time pining for city comforts and making demands I cannot meet." "I understand that ranch life requires hard work," Catherine said, keeping her voice steady despite the growing dread in her stomach. "I am prepared to do my part. See that you are," Hemmings said. "I had a wife before 8 years back. She could not handle the isolation and took off with a traveling preacher. Left me looking like a fool in front of the whole territory. I will not be made a fool of twice, Miss Brennan." Catherine had not known about a previous wife, and the revelation sat heavy in her chest alongside all the other doubts that had been accumulating since her arrival. She had agreed to this arrangement because her father had died leaving debts she could not pay, because her only other option had been to accept the unwanted attentions of her father's business partner, a man 3 times her age with hands that lingered too long on her shoulders. Marriage to a Western rancher had seemed like an escape, a chance at a new life, but now she wondered if she had merely exchanged one trap for another. The Hemmings ranch, when they finally reached it, was a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a dusty yard, the main house a squat adobe structure with small windows and a sagging porch. A few horses stood in a corral, tails swishing at flies, and chickens scratched in the dirt near what looked like a kitchen garden gone mostly to weeds. It was not the prosperous spread she had imagined from Hemmings's letters, and the disappointment must have shown on her face because Hemmings's expression went hard. "It is not a palace, but it is mine, free and clear," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "You will find your quarters inside. I expect supper at 6 o'clock sharp, and I take my coffee black." He left her sitting on the wagon bench, striding off toward the barn without another word, and Catherine sat there for a long moment, feeling the full weight of her situation settle over her like the dust that still coated every inch of her skin. Then she climbed down, retrieved her trunk from the wagon bed with difficulty, and dragged it across the yard and up onto the porch, her arms burning with the effort and sweat trickling down her spine beneath her layers of Eastern clothing wholly unsuited to the Arizona heat. The inside of the house was dim and sparse, a main room with a table and chairs, a cast iron stove, and shelves holding dishes and dry goods, with 2 doors leading off to what she assumed were bedrooms. Catherine found a basin and a pitcher of water on a stand near the door and used a precious cupful to wash her face and hands, watching the water turn brown with the dust of her journey. Her reflection in the small mirror on the wall showed a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and hair coming loose from its pins, and she looked away quickly before the tears threatening behind her eyes could fall. She had agreed to marry Walter Hemmings sight unseen, had signed papers and made promises, and there was no going back now even if she wanted to, which she very much did. The implications of separate bedrooms should have relieved her, but instead they felt ominous, as though Hemmings expected her to prove herself worthy before he would claim her as a wife in truth. Catherine unpacked her trunk with mechanical efficiency, hanging her few dresses on pegs driven into the wall and arranging her toilet items on the small table beside the bed. And then she returned to the main room to assess what she had to work with for preparing supper. The pantry held basics: flour and beans and coffee, some salted pork and dried peppers, potatoes that were starting to sprout and onions going soft in their basket. Catherine had learned to cook from her mother and had kept house for her father after her mother died, so she knew her way around a kitchen, even if this particular kitchen was far more primitive than what she was used to. She built up the fire in the stove, found a heavy skillet and a pot, and set about making a meal from what was available, falling into the familiar rhythms of chopping and stirring and seasoning, letting the work occupy her hands while her mind spun in circles. She kept thinking about James Cordell, about the way he had looked at her as though she were something remarkable despite being covered head to toe in dust, about the gentleness in his voice and the concern in his eyes when he had given her his name, and told her to send word if she needed anything. She had no business thinking about another man when she was here to marry Walter Hemmings, but she could not seem to stop the comparison between Hemmings's cold practicality and Cordell's unexpected warmth, between a man who saw her as a worker to be evaluated and one who had called her a queen. Hemmings came in at 6 o'clock exactly, dropping into a chair at the table without washing or removing his hat, and Catherine served him the meal she had prepared: fried potatoes and pork with peppers and onions, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. He ate in silence, shoveling food into his mouth without comment, and Catherine sat across from him picking at her own plate, her appetite having fled sometime during the past hour. "It will do," Hemmings said when he had finished, pushing his plate away. "You can cook well enough, that is something." "Thank you," Catherine said, though the faint praise felt more like an insult than a compliment. "We will be married on Sunday," Hemmings continued, reaching for his coffee. "The preacher comes through Redemption Springs once a month, and he will be there this week. I have already made the arrangements. After that, you will take up your duties properly as my wife." Catherine's hands tightened on her fork, and she made herself breathe slowly through the panic rising in her throat. 3 days. She had 3 days before she would be bound to this man permanently, and the thought made her want to run screaming into the desert, despite the fact that she had nowhere to run to and no resources to sustain herself if she tried. "I understand," she said, because what else could she say? "Good," Hemmings said, standing. "I have paperwork to attend to in my room. You will clean up here and then keep to your own room. I do not hold with a man and woman living as husband and wife before they are properly married in the eyes of God and the law." He left her alone with the dirty dishes, and Catherine sat for a moment longer before rising to clear the table, heating water to wash the plates and skillet, restoring order to the kitchen while darkness fell outside the small windows. When everything was clean and put away, she retreated to her narrow room and closed the door, sitting on the edge of the bed and finally allowing herself to cry, silent tears that tracked through what was left of the dust on her face and dripped onto her hands folded in her lap. She had been so certain that coming west was the right choice, that marriage to a stranger could not possibly be worse than the alternative she had faced in Boston, but now she was not so sure. Walter Hemmings was not cruel exactly, but he was cold and demanding and viewed her as a piece of property rather than a person. And the thought of spending the rest of her life trying to meet his standards while receiving nothing in return but criticism made her feel hollow inside. Catherine lay down fully clothed on top of the blanket, too exhausted to properly undress, and stared at the ceiling trying to imagine a future that did not fill her with dread. Instead, Her mind conjured the image of James Cordell standing in the dusty street of Redemption Springs, gray-green eyes fixed on her face, telling her she wore the West like a queen, and she fell asleep with his voice echoing in her ears, and his face the last thing she saw behind her closed eyelids. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work and growing apprehension. Hemmings rose before dawn and left the house without breakfast, returning only for the midday meal and then again at supper, speaking to Catherine only to issue instructions or point out deficiencies in her work. She cooked and cleaned and tended the scraggly garden, hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached, fed the chickens and collected eggs, and tried to ignore the way Hemmings watched her sometimes with an expression that was more calculating than affectionate. On Saturday evening, Hemmings informed her that they would leave for town at first light Sunday morning, that she should wear her best dress for the ceremony, and that he expected her to conduct herself with proper dignity as befitted his wife. Catherine agreed quietly, her stomach a knot of anxiety, and spent half the night lying awake trying to convince herself that she could go through with this, that marriage to Hemmings was still better than the alternative she had left behind in Boston. She was not convinced, but she rose before dawn anyway and washed in cold water, braiding her hair carefully and pinning it up, then putting on the one good dress she owned that was not covered in travel dust, a simple gown of dark blue cotton with a high collar and long sleeves. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw a woman who looked like she was preparing for a funeral rather than a wedding, pale and solemn with shadows under her eyes. Hemmings was waiting by the wagon when she emerged, dressed in what must be his Sunday best, trousers and a jacket that smelled of camphor and a clean shirt buttoned to the throat. He looked her over with a critical eye and apparently found her acceptable, because he nodded once and gestured for her to climb up onto the wagon bench. The ride to Redemption Springs took the same hour it had taken when Catherine first arrived, and she spent the time looking at the landscape properly for the first time, noticing details she had missed in her exhausted haze 3 days earlier. The desert was beautiful in its own stark way, the early morning light turning the rocks golden and the shadows deep purple, the air crisp and clear and scented with sage. Under other circumstances, she thought she might have loved it here, might have found peace in the vast openness and the endless sky. Redemption Springs was more active on a Sunday morning, people gathering for the church service that the traveling preacher would conduct before he performed the marriage ceremony. Catherine recognized a few faces from her arrival, the depot agent and the woman who ran the boarding house, others she had not seen before. Ranchers and townspeople dressed in their best and eyeing her with open curiosity as Hemmings helped her down from the wagon with more courtesy than he had shown her all week. The church was a simple wooden building with rough-hewn pews and a cross on the wall behind the pulpit, and Catherine found herself seated beside Hemmings in the second row, very aware of the eyes on the back of her head and the whispers that followed her entrance. The preacher was a lean man with fierce eyes and a voice that carried to the rafters, and he preached about duty and righteousness, and the sanctity of marriage vows while Catherine sat with her hands folded and her heart hammering against her ribs. After the service ended, the congregation filed out into the sunshine, but Hemmings kept his hand on Catherine's elbow, keeping her in place while the preacher gathered his Bible and his notes. A few people lingered, witnesses required for the ceremony, and Catherine found herself standing at the front of the church with Hemmings beside her and the preacher across from them, about to speak vows that would bind her for life to a man she did not love and was not entirely sure she even liked. The door at the back of the church opened and Catherine heard bootsteps on the wooden floor, heard someone clear their throat, and then a voice she had heard in her dreams every night since her arrival said, "I am sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with Miss Brennan before this ceremony proceeds." Catherine turned, and there was James Cordell standing in the aisle with his hat in his hands, his expression serious and his eyes fixed on her face. Hemmings made an angry noise starting forward, but the preacher held up a hand. Mr. Cordell, you cannot simply burst into a wedding ceremony and make demands, the preacher said, though his tone suggested he was more curious than offended. I am not making demands, James said, still looking at Catherine. I am asking Miss Brennan if this is truly what she wants, if she has entered into this agreement of her own free will and with full understanding of what it entails. Of course she has, Hemmings snapped. We have a contract, legal and binding, and she has come all the way from Boston to honor it. You have no right to interfere, Cordell. I have every right to ensure that a woman is not being coerced into a marriage she does not want, James said, and now he took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Catherine's face. Miss Brennan, I know we have only met once, and I have no claim on you and no right to disrupt your plans. But I have not been able to stop thinking about you since I saw you step off that stage, and I have been asking around town about Hemmings and his situation, and what I have learned troubles me deeply. This is outrageous, Hemmings said, his face going red. Preacher, send this man away before I do it myself. What have you learned? Catherine asked, finding her voice though it came out smaller than she intended. Her heart was racing now for entirely different reasons, hope and fear warring in her chest. James glanced at Hemmings, then back at Catherine. I learned that Hemmings's first wife did not run off with a preacher. She died under suspicious circumstances, a fall down the stairs that left her with a broken neck, and there were some who wondered if it was truly an accident. I learned that he is in debt to nearly every merchant in town, and that his ranch is mortgaged to the limit. I learned that he has a reputation for a mean temper, especially when he has been drinking, and that more than one person has expressed concern about any woman who might be fool enough to tie herself to him. The church had gone very quiet, the handful of witnesses staring with wide eyes, the preacher looking troubled, and Hemmings looking like he wanted to commit murder right there in the house of God. Catherine felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her, all her vague unease about Hemmings crystallizing into cold, hard certainty that she had nearly made a terrible mistake. Those are lies, Hemmings said, but his voice lacked conviction. Gossip and slander from people who are jealous of what I have built. Is it true about your first wife? Catherine asked quietly, looking at Hemmings directly for the first time since James had walked into the church. Hemmings's jaw worked, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. My wife fell down the stairs. It was an accident, investigated and ruled as such. What people choose to whisper behind my back is not my concern. But you did not tell me you had been married before until we were already at your ranch, Catherine said, feeling anger start to burn through the fear. You did not mention debts or a mortgage or any of the truth about your situation. You presented yourself in your letters as a prosperous rancher looking for a partner, not a man in desperate straits looking for unpaid labor. I was not obligated to share every detail of my personal affairs with a stranger, Hemmings shot back. We have a contract, Miss Brennan. You agreed to marry me, and I expect you to honor that agreement. Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who was angry at being exposed, who cared nothing for her beyond what use she could be to him, who might well be dangerous if crossed. Then she looked at James Cordell, who was still standing in the aisle watching her with an expression that was part hope and part concern, a man who had taken the trouble to investigate on her behalf, despite having no obligation to do so, who had risked Hemmings's wrath to give her information she needed to make an informed choice. No, Catherine said, and the word came out stronger than she expected, ringing in the small church. I will not honor a contract that was based on deception and lies. I will not marry you, Mr. Hemmings. For a moment she thought Hemmings might strike her, his face going from red to purple, his whole body tensing with rage. But there were too many witnesses, too many eyes watching, and even he was not reckless enough to assault a woman in front of a preacher and half the town. Instead, he turned that rage on James. This is your doing, Cordell, he snarled. You have wanted to see me brought low since the dispute over the water rights, and now you think you can steal my bride right out from under me. "I am not stealing anyone," James said calmly. "I am simply giving Miss Brennan information she deserved to have before making a life-altering decision. What she chooses to do with that information is entirely up to her." "You will regret this," Hemmings said, advancing on James with his fists still clenched. "Both of you will regret this." The preacher stepped between them, his voice sharp with authority. "Mr. Hemmings, you will take yourself out of this church immediately, or I will ask these good people to escort you out. Threats have no place in the house of the Lord, and Miss Brennan has made her choice clear. There will be no wedding today." Hemmings looked around at the faces watching him, saw no sympathy or support, and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. He grabbed his hat from the pew where he had left it and stormed out of the church, the door banging shut behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Catherine stood very still, trembling with reaction, scarcely able to believe what she had just done. She had ended her engagement, had publicly refused to marry Walter Hemmings, and now she had no prospects and no plan and nowhere to go, stranded in a territory thousands of miles from anything familiar. The reality of her situation hit her all at once, and she swayed on her feet, her vision going dark at the edges. James was there in an instant, his hand at her elbow steadying her, his voice low and concerned. "Easy now, you are all right, I have got you." "I have nothing," Catherine whispered, looking up at him with panic rising in her throat. "No money, no family, no way to get back east even if I wanted to go. What have I done?" "You have saved yourself from a bad marriage and possibly worse," James said firmly. "As for the rest, we will figure it out. You are not alone, Miss Brennan." The preacher cleared his throat, and Catherine looked over to find him watching them with a thoughtful expression. "Miss Brennan, if you find yourself in need of respectable lodging while you determine your next steps, Mrs. Kowalski runs a boarding house here in town and would certainly have a room available. As for employment, I know several families who would welcome a woman with Eastern education and refinement to help with children or household management." "I have no money to pay for lodging," Catherine said, humiliation burning in her cheeks. "Mr. Hemmings paid my passage west, and I have nothing of my own except what is in my trunk, which is still at his ranch." "I will handle the boarding house," James said immediately. "And I will retrieve your trunk from Hemmings, along with any other belongings you left there. You need not worry about those practicalities." Catherine turned to look at him, this stranger who kept offering her kindness without asking for anything in return. "Why are you doing this?" "You do not know me, Mr. Cordell. You have no obligation to involve yourself in my affairs." James smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes and made her stomach perform that same acrobatic flip it had done when she first met him. "I told you when you arrived that you wear the West like a queen, Miss Brennan. I meant it. You stood there covered in dust looking like you had been through hell, and all I could think was that you were the most magnificent thing I had ever seen. When I heard you were planning to marry Hemmings, I knew I had to at least make certain you understood what you were agreeing to. Beyond that, well, I suppose I hoped you might choose not to marry him. And if you did choose not to marry him, I hoped I might have a chance to get to know you properly, if you were willing." Catherine stared at him, scarcely able to process what he was saying, the implication behind his words making her heart race and her breath catch. "You interrupted my wedding because you were hoping to court me yourself." "I interrupted your wedding because it was the right thing to do," James corrected gently. "But yes, I will not deny that I hoped for a chance to see you again under better circumstances. You have been in my thoughts constantly since I first saw you, Catherine, and I know that is forward of me to say, but I am a plain-spoken man and I believe in honesty." The use of her given name sent a shiver down her spine, intimate and presumptuous and absolutely perfect somehow. Catherine realized she was still standing very close to him, his hand still at her elbow, and that she had no desire whatsoever to step away. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to get to know you better as well, Mr. Cordell." though I should warn you that I am currently without prospects or resources, and getting to know me will likely be more trouble than it is worth." "James," he said. "Please call me James, and I have never been afraid of trouble, Catherine. In fact, I am rather counting on you being worth every bit of it." The preacher cleared his throat again, more loudly this time, and Catherine suddenly remembered they had an audience of fascinated townspeople who were taking in every word of this exchange with barely concealed delight. She stepped back from James, feeling heat rise in her face, and attempted to compose herself into something resembling propriety. "Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house is just down the street," the preacher said, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "I will walk with you and make the introductions if you like, Miss Brennan. I suspect you could use a friendly face and a cup of tea after this morning's excitement." Catherine nodded gratefully, and James offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. She placed her hand on his sleeve, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric, and let him escort her out of the church and into the bright Arizona sunshine where her life had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated when she woke that morning preparing to become Mrs. Walter Hemmings, Mrs. Kowalski turned out to be a formidable Polish woman in her 50s who took one look at Catherine's pale face and immediately ushered her into a cozy parlor, installed her on an overstuffed sofa, and produced tea and butter cookies with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. The preacher explained the situation in broad strokes, and Mrs. Kowalski listened with sharp eyes that missed nothing, particularly the way James Cordell hovered near Catherine as though afraid she might vanish if he stopped watching her. "You will stay here as long as you need, Mrs. Kowalski declared in her accented English. "I have a room upstairs, clean and comfortable, and you will pay me when you are able. No arguments." "Mrs. Kowalski, I cannot accept charity," Catherine protested weakly, though the relief she felt at having a place to stay made her protest largely token. "It is not charity, it is good business," Mrs. Kowalski said firmly. "You will help me here with the cooking and cleaning, and in return you have room and board. Fair exchange, yes." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from a woman she had only just met. "Yes, that is more than fair. Thank you." James had been conferring quietly with the preacher, and now he turned back to Catherine with a determined expression. "I am going out to Hemmings's place now to collect your trunk. Is there anything else there that belongs to you?" Catherine thought back over the 3 miserable days she had spent at the Hemmings ranch. "Just my trunk and my traveling cloak. Everything else was his or was already there when I arrived." "I will have it all back to you by this evening," James promised. "Hemmings may bluster, but he will not refuse when he understands I am in earnest." "Be careful," Catherine said, suddenly afraid that her problems were going to lead to violence between the two men. "He was very angry when he left the church. I do not want you to be hurt on my account." James smiled at her, that warm smile that made her feel like the only person in the world. "I can handle Walter Hemmings, Catherine. You need not worry about me." He left with a tip of his hat, and Catherine watched him go with a strange mixture of anxiety and something else, something warm and hopeful that she had not felt since before her father died. Mrs. Kowalski watched her watching James, and when Catherine turned back, the older woman was smiling knowingly. "That one, he is a good man," Mrs. Kowalski said, pouring more tea into Catherine's cup. "He runs an honest ranch, treats his men fairly, helps his neighbors when they need it. Not like that Hemmings, who is mean as a snake and twice as sneaky. You made the right choice today, child." "I hope so," Catherine said quietly. "Though I confess I am terrified about what happens next. I have never been without family or resources before, and I am very far from home." "Home is what you make it," Mrs. Kowalski said philosophically. "I left Poland 30 years ago with my husband, God rest his soul. We came west to make our fortune, and instead we made a life. Sometimes that is better than fortune, yes." Catherine thought about that, about the difference between fortune and life, between security and happiness, and found herself nodding slowly. Perhaps coming west had been the right choice after all, just not in the way she had originally envisioned, Mrs. Kowalski showed Catherine to a room on the second floor, a pleasant space with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street of Redemption Springs. It was modest but clean and infinitely preferable to the narrow room at Hemmings's ranch, and Catherine sank down onto the bed feeling exhaustion wash over her now that the crisis had passed. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, someone was knocking gently on the door and Mrs. Kowalski was calling her name. Catherine rose and opened the door to find the older woman smiling. "Mr. Cordell has returned with your things," Mrs. Kowalski said. "He is downstairs in the parlor if you wish to thank him." Catherine quickly tidied her hair and smoothed her dress, then hurried downstairs to find James indeed waiting in the parlor, her trunk on the floor beside him and her cloak folded neatly over the back of a chair. He stood when she entered, and she saw with alarm that his knuckles were scraped and there was the beginning of a bruise along his jaw. "What happened?" she demanded, crossing to him and reaching up without thinking to touch the bruise gently. "Did he fight you?" James caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment before lowering it but not releasing it. "Hemmings was drunk and belligerent, and he took a swing at me when I told him I was taking your belongings. I defended myself, that is all. He will have a black eye and wounded pride, but nothing worse." "I am so sorry," Catherine said miserably. "This is all my fault. If I had never come here, if I had made better choices." "Stop," James said firmly, using his free hand to tilt her chin up until she was looking at him. "You made the best choices you could with the information you had. Hemmings deceived you, and you had the courage to walk away when you learned the truth. That took strength, Catherine. Do not diminish it by second-guessing yourself now." They were standing very close together, closer than was strictly proper, and Catherine was intensely aware of his hand still holding hers, of his other hand cupping her face, of the way he was looking at her as though she were something precious and rare. She should step back, should maintain proper distance, but she found she could not make herself move away. "I do not know what I am doing," she whispered. "Everything I thought I knew about my life has fallen apart and I am standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what comes next." "Then perhaps we can figure it out together," James said softly. "I know this is all happening very quickly, and I know you have no reason to trust me beyond what I have done for you today. But I would like a chance to prove myself, Catherine. I would like permission to court you properly, to give you time to know me and decide if what I feel might be something you could feel as well." Catherine's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "And what is it you feel, James?" He smiled, slow and sweet. "Like I have been waiting my whole life for someone to step off a stagecoach and turn my world upside down. Like you are the answer to questions I did not even know I was asking. Like I could spend the rest of my days learning everything there is to know about you and still find new things to discover." It was possibly the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, and Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes even as she found herself smiling. That is a great deal to feel based on one meeting in a dusty street and one interrupted wedding. "Perhaps," James acknowledged. "But I trust my instincts, and every instinct I possess is telling me that you are someone extraordinary, Catherine Brennan, someone worth fighting for." "I would like that," Catherine heard herself say. "I would like you to court me properly, and I would like time to know you, and I would like to see if what you feel might be something I could feel as well." Though if she were being honest with herself, she already felt it, that pull toward him that had started the moment he spoke to her in the street and called her a queen despite the dust covering her from head to toe. She had known him only days, had spoken to him perhaps a total of an hour, but somehow she felt more seen and understood by James Cordell than she had by Walter Hemmings after weeks of correspondence and 3 days under his roof. James raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender and old-fashioned that it made her breath catch. "Thank you for giving me a chance. I promise you will not regret it." He took his leave after that, tipping his hat to Mrs. Kowalski and reminding Catherine that he would be in town again in a few days, and hoped she would allow him to take her to dinner at the hotel restaurant. Catherine agreed, and then he was gone, leaving her standing in the parlor with her hand tingling from his kiss and her heart full of a cautious, fragile hope. The next several weeks passed in a pattern that began to feel almost like normalcy. Catherine worked hard at the boarding house, cooking and cleaning and helping Mrs. Kowalski manage the steady stream of travelers and long-term residents who passed through. She proved to have a talent for the work, her Eastern manners and education making her particularly good at managing difficult guests and soothing ruffled feathers. James came to town twice a week without fail, and each time he took Catherine for dinner or for a walk along the creek that ran behind the town, or simply to sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk. They spoke about everything and nothing, Catherine sharing stories of her childhood in Boston and her parents and her journey west, James telling her about growing up on a ranch in Texas and coming to Arizona Territory 5 years earlier to start his own operation, about the challenges and rewards of building something from nothing in a hard land. She learned that he was 29 years old, that his parents were still alive and living in Texas with his 2 younger sisters, that he had served briefly as a deputy sheriff, before deciding he preferred ranching to law enforcement, that he loved this territory with a fierce passion and could not imagine living anywhere else. He learned that she was 22, that she had been educated at a private school and could read Latin and French, that she loved books and music and had once dreamed of being a teacher, that she had come west out of desperation but was beginning to think it might have been destiny instead. By the time a month had passed, Catherine was absolutely certain she was falling in love with James Cordell, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. She had come west expecting to marry a stranger and build a practical partnership, and instead she had found something she had never expected, a connection that felt like coming home, like finding a piece of herself she had not known was missing. James was everything Walter Hemmings was not, kind and patient and attentive, interested in her thoughts and opinions, respectful of her boundaries, willing to wait until she was ready for more than chaste kisses on the hand, or recently, sweet brief kisses on the lips that left her wanting more but grateful he did not push for it. He made her laugh with stories of ranch mishaps and impressed her with his knowledge of the land and the animals and the delicate balance required to make a living in the territory. He introduced her to his ranch foreman and the men who worked for him, all of whom treated her with courtesy and respect that spoke to the kind of man James was and the loyalty he inspired. One evening in late September, James took Catherine out to his ranch for the first time, driving her in his buggy along the road that led north from town, past the turnoff to Hemmings's place, and onto a valley that opened up between 2 ridges, green with grass and dotted with cattle. The ranch house was adobe like most buildings in the territory, but larger and better maintained than Hemmings's, with a wide covered porch and shutters at the windows painted a cheerful blue. "It is not fancy," James said, helping Catherine down from the buggy, "but it is mine and I have worked hard to make it prosperous. I run about 500 head of cattle and I am planning to expand into horses as well. The land is good, plenty of water from the springs higher up in the hills, and I have good men working for me who I trust." Catherine looked around at the neat outbuildings, the well-tended corrals, the garden plot near the house where late-season vegetables were still producing, and felt a pang of something that might have been longing. This was what she had imagined when she agreed to come west, a real home with a man who took pride in his work and wanted to build something lasting. "It is beautiful," she said honestly. "You have every reason to be proud of what you have accomplished, James." He smiled, pleased by her approval, and led her up onto the porch. "I wanted you to see it, to understand what kind of life I could offer you if you were interested in sharing it." Catherine's heart stuttered in her chest. "James, I know it is too soon," he said quickly, turning to face her and taking both her hands in his. I know we have only been courting for a month and that you came here expecting to marry someone else and that you might need more time before you are ready to think about marriage again. But I also know my own heart, Catherine, and I love you. I have loved you since I saw you step off that stagecoach looking like you had conquered the desert instead of simply traveling through it. I love your courage and your strength and your kindness. I love the way you throw yourself into work at the boarding house and treat everyone with respect and dignity. I love the way you laugh at my terrible jokes and the way you get excited when you talk about books. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Catherine felt tears spill over, tracking down her cheeks, but these were happy tears, joyful tears, tears of relief and love and overwhelming emotion. I love you too, she said, her voice shaking. I did not think I could fall in love so quickly, did not think it was possible to feel this way about someone I have known for such a short time, but I do, James. I love you, and I want to share your life, and I want to build a home with you here in this beautiful place. James let out a whoop of pure joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around on the porch while she laughed breathlessly and clung to his shoulders. When he set her down, he kissed her properly for the first time, deep and thorough and full of promise, and Catherine kissed him back with all the passion and hope and love she had been holding inside for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers and grinned. Marry me, Catherine, tomorrow if you are willing, or next week or next month, but marry me and stay here and help me build something wonderful. Yes, Catherine said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, James Cordell, and I will stay here, and we will build something wonderful together. They were married 2 weeks later in the same little church where Catherine had refused to marry Walter Hemmings, but this time the ceremony was full of joy instead of dread, the church packed with townspeople and ranchers who had come to wish the couple well. Mrs. Kowalski cried openly. The preacher beamed as though he had personally orchestrated the match, and James looked at Catherine like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever uttered. Catherine wore a new dress that she had sewn herself with fabric James had insisted on buying her, a beautiful cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that one of James's ranch hands had gathered for her that morning. She spoke her vows in a clear voice, meaning every word, and when James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and kissed her to seal their marriage, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel, a boisterous affair with food and music and dancing, and Catherine found herself swept up in celebration, meeting people who would be her neighbors and friends, accepting congratulations and well wishes, watching James across the room and feeling her heart swell with love every time their eyes met. When the party finally began to wind down in the late afternoon, James collected Catherine and drove her out to the ranch, to the home that was now hers as well as his, and carried her over the threshold with a tenderness that made her want to cry again. He showed her through the house properly, the large main room with its fireplace and comfortable furniture, the spacious kitchen with a modern stove and plenty of workspace, the bedroom with its big bed covered in a quilt his mother had made, and Catherine looked at all of it and saw not what it was but what it would become, a home filled with love and laughter and life. That night, James made love to her with patience and gentleness, taking his time to show her all the ways he loved her, and Catherine gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, marveling at the intimacy and connection and the rightness of being with him this way. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt his mother had made, and Catherine rested her head on James's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. The months that followed were full of hard work and deep satisfaction. Catherine threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, sewing curtains and cushions, planting a proper garden in the spring, learning to cook on a larger scale to feed James and the ranch hands, managing the household accounts and proving to have a good head for the business side of ranching. James consulted her on every major decision, valuing her opinion and her Eastern education. And together, they made plans for expanding the operation, for breeding horses as well as cattle, for making the 6 Points Ranch one of the most successful operations in the territory. Catherine also began teaching, offering lessons in reading and writing to the children of neighboring ranches and some of the Mexican families who worked the land nearby. She held class 3 times a week in the ranch house, and James built her a proper schoolroom in one of the outbuildings, and she found deep joy in sharing her love of learning with students who were hungry for education. Walter Hemmings remained a distant shadow on the edges of their life, his ranch continuing to struggle, his reputation suffering further when it came out that he had beaten one of his ranch hands badly enough to put the man in the doctor's care for a week. Catherine heard the stories and felt nothing but relief that she had escaped that fate, and profound gratitude for James's intervention that day in the church. In the spring of 1884, Catherine discovered she was pregnant, and James received the news with such obvious joy that she found herself laughing and crying at the same time. He became even more protective and attentive if such a thing were possible, constantly worried that she was working too hard or not eating enough, and Catherine endured his fussing with patience and amusement, touched by the depth of his care for her and their coming child. Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy baby with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and they named him Thomas, after Catherine's father. James held his son with reverence, tears streaming down his face, and promised the baby that he would always be loved and protected and taught to be a good man who treated people with respect and kindness. Catherine watched her husband with their child and felt her heart might burst with love, for James, for Thomas, for the life they had built together in this wild, beautiful place so far from where she had started but exactly where she was meant to be. Life settled into a rhythm shaped by the seasons and the needs of the ranch. Thomas grew from baby to toddler, learning to walk on sturdy legs that carried him all over the ranch under the watchful eyes of his parents and the ranch hands who all adored him. Catherine taught her classes and managed the household and worked beside James in all the ways that mattered, and their partnership deepened into something solid and unshakable. In the summer of 1886, Catherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Mary after James's mother. She had her mother's delicate features and her father's determined chin, and from the very beginning she made it clear that she had opinions about how things should be done and was not afraid to express them loudly. James doted on both his children equally, teaching Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, holding Mary for hours while she slept against his shoulder, reading to them from the books Catherine ordered from back east, taking them with him around the ranch when his work allowed so they could learn the land and the animals and what it meant to be stewards of a place rather than just owners. The 6 Points Ranch prospered, growing in size and reputation, known for quality cattle and horses and for the integrity of the man who ran it. James took on more hired hands as the operation expanded, built new barns and corrals, improved the irrigation system to make the land even more productive, and through it all he consulted Catherine, relied on her business acumen and her ability to see angles he might miss, and gave her full credit for her contributions to their success. In 1888, Catherine opened a proper school in Redemption Springs, a one-room building that James and several other ranchers built together, and she took on the role of teacher full-time, riding into town 3 days a week to teach children from all over the area. She loved the work, loved seeing her students learn and grow, loved being part of building something lasting in the community. Mrs. Kowalski remained a close friend, often joining the Cordell family for Sunday dinners at the ranch, regaling Thomas and Mary with stories of the old country and sneaking them sweets when she thought their parents were not looking. The older woman had become like a grandmother to the children, and Catherine treasured the bond between them, grateful for the kindness Mrs. Kowalski had shown her when she had been lost and alone and desperate. In the spring of 1889, Catherine gave birth to their third child, another son they named Daniel. He was a quiet baby, observant and calm, content to watch his older siblings play from the safety of his mother's arms. James joked that Daniel had inherited his mother's thoughtful nature, while Thomas and Mary had gotten his tendency to jump into things head first and sort out the consequences later. The family continued to grow and thrive, weathering the challenges that came with ranch life, drought years and hard winters, and the occasional conflict with neighboring ranchers over water rights or grazing boundaries, but always emerging stronger on the other side because they faced everything together. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved working with the horses, showing a natural gift for training and gentling even the most stubborn animals. Mary was fearless and adventurous, climbing trees and chasing cattle, and declaring she was going to be a rancher just like her father, and neither James nor Catherine saw any reason to discourage her ambitions. Daniel was the scholar, more interested in books and learning than in the physical work of the ranch, and Catherine nurtured that love of knowledge, already envisioning him perhaps going back east for university one day. In 1891, when Thomas was 7, Mary 5, and Daniel 2, the territory began to see more settlement, more people moving west looking for opportunity and land. Redemption Springs grew from a small town into a more substantial community, with additional stores and a proper doctor, and even a small newspaper. The school expanded, and Catherine took on an assistant teacher to help manage the increasing number of students. James's parents came for a visit that summer, traveling from Texas to meet their grandchildren and see the ranch their son had built. James's mother embraced Catherine warmly, telling her she had prayed for years that her son would find a good woman to share his life, and that God had clearly answered those prayers in abundance. James's father, a weathered rancher with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor, told James privately that he had done well for himself and should count his blessings every day, advice James assured his father he already followed religiously. The visit was a joyful time, full of laughter and stories and the pleasure of extended family coming together. James's sisters wrote regularly, sharing news of their own lives and families in Texas, and Catherine corresponded with them, building relationships through letters that helped bridge the distance between them. In 1892, Walter Hemmings finally lost his ranch to foreclosure and left the territory, and Catherine felt only relief that he was gone. That chapter of her life closed permanently. She thought sometimes about what her life might have been if James had not walked into that church, if she had gone through with the marriage to Hemmings, and she could not imagine a bleaker fate than the one she had escaped. She never regretted her decision to come west, not for a moment, even though it had not worked out anything like she had planned. She had been looking for security and a practical arrangement, and instead she had found love and partnership and a home in the truest sense of the word. By 1894, the 6 Points Ranch was one of the most prosperous operations in the territory, and James was respected throughout the region as a fair dealer and a good neighbor. He served on the territorial council for a time, helping make decisions about land use and water rights that would affect the region for generations. Catherine continued teaching, shaping young minds and encouraging her students to dream big even in this hard land where survival often took precedence over ambition. Thomas was 10 now, already tall and strong, capable of doing a man's work on the ranch when needed. Mary was 8, still fearless and determined, learning everything she could about every aspect of ranching and ranching business. Daniel was 5, more interested in the schoolroom than the barn, but happy and loved and encouraged to follow his own path. On a warm evening in October of 1894, Catherine stood on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day end and the first stars begin to appear. "Do you ever think about that day you arrived?" James asked quietly. "Standing in the street covered in dust, looking like you were ready to take on the world or collapse trying," Catherine smiled, leaning back against him. "I think about it often. I was so frightened, so uncertain about what I had done, coming all this way to marry a stranger." "And instead, you married a different stranger," James said with a chuckle. "The right stranger," Catherine corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "I did not know it at the time, but I was standing in that dusty street waiting for you, James. Waiting for someone to see me, really see me, and tell me I was not making a terrible mistake in coming here." "You wear the West like a queen," James quoted softly, his eyes warm with love and memory. "I meant it then, and I mean it now, Catherine. You were made for this place, or it was made for you, and I thank God every day that you stepped off that stagecoach and into my life." Catherine kissed him, sweet and lingering, 11 years of love and partnership and shared dreams in that single kiss. They had built something remarkable together, a life and a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And she could not imagine anything more perfect than standing here with this man, watching the desert sunset, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same blessed, ordinary joy they had found in each other. In 1896, Catherine gave birth to their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Margaret, who arrived with a full head of red gold hair that mystified everyone until James remembered his grandmother had been a redhead. Margaret was a sunny, happy baby who grew into a cheerful child, always singing or laughing, bringing light and joy wherever she went. Thomas was 12 when Margaret was born, already taking on significant responsibility on the ranch, and he adored his baby sister, carrying her around and teaching her songs and telling her stories. Mary was 10, still determined to be a rancher, already helping James with the books and the business side of the operation. Daniel was 7, reading everything he could get his hands on and showing a particular interest in history and law. The family was complete, Catherine felt, 4 children who were healthy and happy and growing up with strong values and endless opportunity. She and James had built exactly what they had dreamed of, a thriving ranch and a loving family and a place in the community that mattered. The turn of the century brought changes to the territory, more modernization and infrastructure, talk of eventual statehood, improved roads, and the arrival of telegraph lines that made communication with the rest of the country faster and easier. The Cordells adapted and thrived, always looking forward while honoring the hard work and sacrifice that had brought them to this place. In 1903, Thomas was 19, a grown man helping run the ranch alongside his father, already being courted by several young women in the area, though he seemed in no hurry to settle down. Mary was 17, just as determined to make her mark on the ranching world as she had been as a child, already talking about starting her own operation one day with her father's guidance and support. Daniel was 14, an excellent student who had already declared his intention to study law, and Catherine and James had begun making plans for him to attend university back east when the time came. Margaret was 7, still sunny and cheerful, the baby of the family who brought joy to everyone around her. Catherine was 42 now, her dark hair showing threads of silver, her hands showing the marks of years of hard work. But she was happy in a deep, enduring way that had nothing to do with youth or beauty and everything to do with a life well lived. James was 47, still strong and capable, a few more lines on his face and a touch of gray at his temples, but his eyes still lit up every time he looked at her, and his love had only deepened with the passage of time. One evening in the summer of 1903, Catherine and James sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching the sunset and talking about their day, about the children and the ranch and their plans for the future. The comfortable silence between them was the silence of two people who knew each other so well that words were often unnecessary. And Catherine felt a profound contentment settle over her, the knowledge that this was exactly where she was meant to be. "I was thinking today about how different my life might have been," Catherine said, breaking the silence. "If you had not walked into that church, if you had not cared enough to investigate Hemmings, if you had not given me the information I needed to make a different choice." "I was terrified you would not believe me," James admitted. "Or that you would believe me but feel obligated to go through with the marriage anyway because you had come so far and had no other options." "I think I knew, even before you walked into that church, that I was making a mistake," Catherine said thoughtfully. "There was something about Hemmings that made my skin crawl, some instinct telling me I was not safe with him. But I felt trapped by my own choices, by the contract I had signed and the distance I had traveled. You gave me permission to trust my instincts, James. You gave me an alternative and the courage to take it." "And you gave me everything," James said, reaching over to take her hand. "A family, a true partner, someone to build a life with instead of just managing an operation. You made this ranch a home, Catherine, and you made me a better man than I would have been without you." Catherine squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of his palm, the strength in his fingers. "We made each other better. That is what love does, I think. It takes two people and helps them become the best versions of themselves." They sat in peaceful silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began their nightly display across the vast Arizona sky. In the distance, they could hear Thomas calling instructions to one of the ranch hands, Mary's laughter as she played with Margaret, Daniel reading aloud from a book on the other end of the porch. The sounds of their life, their family, their hard-won happiness. In 1907, Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter, a practical young woman named Sarah who loved ranch life as much as he did. They built a house on 6 Points land with James and Catherine's blessing, and Thomas took on even more responsibility for running the operation, allowing James to begin thinking about eventually passing the ranch on to the next generation. Mary, true to her childhood dreams, started her own small ranching operation on land James helped her purchase, proving herself every bit as capable as any man in the territory. She remained unmarried by choice, declaring she had no time for romance when there was work to be done. And Catherine supported her daughter's independence even as she wondered if Mary might eventually find someone who could keep up with her formidable will and energy. Daniel went off to university in 1909, studying law as he had planned, writing long letters home about his classes and his experiences in the East. He promised to return to the territory after graduation, to use his education to help people in the region who often lacked access to proper legal representation. And Catherine was fiercely proud of his ambition and his commitment to service. Margaret was 13, still cheerful and loving, showing talent as a musician and talking about perhaps becoming a music teacher one day. She brought beauty and joy into every situation, and Catherine often thought that Margaret was the purest expression of the love she and James shared, a child born into security and happiness who had never known hardship or fear. In 1910, Catherine celebrated her 50th birthday, surrounded by her family and friends, amazed at how full her life had become, how far she had traveled from that frightened young woman who stepped off a stagecoach covered in dust and uncertain of her future. James threw her a party that brought together people from all over the territory, ranchers and townspeople and former students, all of them coming to honor a woman who had made a difference in their lives and their community. That night, after the guests had gone home and the children were in bed, James presented Catherine with a gift, a beautiful necklace with a small diamond pendant that caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the room. "I have been saving for this for 2 years," James said, fastening it around her neck. "I wanted to give you something that would last, something that could be passed down to our children and grandchildren, a reminder of what we built together." Catherine touched the pendant with trembling fingers, overcome with emotion. "It is beautiful, James, but you did not need to spend money on something like this. You give me everything I need every single day." "I wanted to," James said simply. "You deserve beautiful things, Catherine. You deserve to be celebrated and honored and shown every day how much you are loved. I told you once that you wear the West like a queen, and I have spent 27 years watching you prove me right. This is my small way of acknowledging what everyone else already knows, that you are remarkable, and that I am the luckiest man alive to call you my wife." Catherine threw her arms around him, holding him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sage and home. "I love you, James Cordell. I have loved you since the moment you defended me in that dusty street, and I will love you until my dying day and beyond." "And I love you, Catherine Cordell," James murmured against her hair. "Always and forever, until the stars fall from the sky and the desert blooms eternal." In 1912, Thomas and Sarah had their first child, a boy they named James after his grandfather, and Catherine became a grandmother for the first time. Holding her grandson in her arms, seeing James's eyes looking back at her from that tiny face, Catherine felt time fold in on itself, remembering holding her own children, remembering being held by her own mother so many years ago in Boston. The cycle of life continuing, generations passing the torch, love flowing forward into the future. Mary expanded her ranching operation, acquiring more land and building a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in the territory. She eventually partnered with a quiet man named Robert, who shared her passion for horses and her fierce independence. And while they never formally married, they built a life together that suited them both perfectly. Daniel returned from university in 1913 with his law degree and opened a practice in Redemption Springs, quickly becoming known for his integrity and his willingness to take on cases others would not touch, defending those who could not defend themselves. He married a schoolteacher named Elizabeth, who shared his ideals and his commitment to justice, and they settled into a home in town within easy visiting distance of the ranch. Margaret grew into a beautiful young woman with her sunny disposition intact, and she did indeed become a music teacher, giving lessons in town and organizing concerts that brought culture and beauty to the territory. She married young, at 19, to a kind man who worked at the general store and adored her completely, and they had 3 daughters in quick succession who filled their home with music and laughter. The years continued to pass, marked by births and marriages and deaths, by good years and hard years, by progress and change and the steady march of time. The Arizona Territory finally achieved statehood in 1912, a milestone James and Catherine celebrated with pride, knowing they had been part of building something that would endure. James began to slow down as he moved into his 60s, his joints aching on cold mornings, his stamina not what it had been, but his mind was still sharp and his love for Catherine still the defining fact of his existence. He gradually handed over more and more responsibility to Thomas while maintaining an advisory role, still consulted on major decisions, but no longer bearing the full weight of running the operation. Catherine continued teaching well into her 50s, finally retiring when her eyes began to trouble her and the daily ride into town became more difficult. She filled her time with her grandchildren, who adored their grandmother Catherine and loved hearing stories about the old days, about stagecoaches and mail-order brides and cowboys who rescued damsels in distress. One evening in 1918, 35 years after Catherine had first arrived in the territory, she and James sat on the porch of the ranch house they had shared for so long, both of them moving a little slower now, James's hair completely silver and Catherine's face showing the lines of a life fully lived. They held hands as they had done countless times before, watching the sun set over the desert that had become as much a part of them as their own heartbeats. "You have any regrets?" James asked, his voice still strong despite his age. "About coming west, about choosing this life?" Catherine smiled, turning to look at the man who had been her partner and her love for more than 3 decades. Not a single one. Every choice I made, every step I took, led me here to you and to this life we built together. How could I regret any of it? I think about that day constantly, James admitted. About standing in that dusty street and seeing you climb down from the stagecoach, about the way my heart stopped when I realized you were there to marry Hemmings. I knew in that moment that I could not let it happen, that I had to at least try to offer you an alternative. You offered me everything, Catherine said softly. You gave me love and respect and partnership and a home. You gave me children and grandchildren and a legacy that will outlast us both. You saw me when I was covered in dust and exhausted and frightened, and you told me I was a queen. You have spent 35 years proving that you meant it. Because it was true, James said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles as he had done that first time in Mrs. Kowalski's parlor. You are remarkable, Catherine Cordell. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God for you every single day. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged. The vastness of the Arizona sky spread above them like a blessing. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, their children and grandchildren going about their evening routines, the cattle settling for the night, the horses nickering softly in their corrals. The life they had built together, solid and enduring, a testament to love and hard work and the courage to choose a different path when the first path proved to be wrong. Catherine thought about that frightened young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in 1883, covered in dust and terrified of what lay ahead, and she marveled at how far that woman had come, how much she had grown and changed and accomplished. The West had tested her in ways she never could have imagined, had demanded everything she had to give and then asked for more. But it had also given her everything that mattered, love and family and purpose and home. James Cordell had seen her potential when she could not see it herself, had looked past the dust and the fear and the uncertainty to the strong, capable, remarkable woman beneath. He had offered her his heart without reservation, had spent decades proving his love through actions as well as words, had built a life with her that honored both of them equally. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Catherine felt profound gratitude for every choice that had led her here, for every hardship that had shaped her, for every moment of joy and struggle and ordinary daily life that had woven together to create this beautiful tapestry of a well-lived existence. She had worn the West like a queen, just as James had said she would, and she had no regrets, no what-ifs, no looking back in sorrow or anger. Only gratitude, deep and abiding, for the unexpected gift of a love that had sustained her through everything, for a partnership that had made her better than she ever could have been alone, for a family that would carry forward the values and the legacy she and James had worked so hard to build. The desert night wrapped around them, warm and welcoming, and Catherine rested her head on James's shoulder and closed her eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of their life, feeling the solid presence of the man she loved beside her, knowing that whatever years remained to them would be lived fully and joyfully, together until the very end. In the distance, she heard Margaret's voice raised in song, teaching her daughters a new melody, and Mary's distinctive laugh as she shared a joke with Robert, and Thomas discussing ranch business with his son James, and Daniel's measured tones as he read a law book on his parents' porch. The sounds of family, of legacy, of love passed down through generations. Catherine smiled, content, and let herself drift in the peaceful moment, secure in the knowledge that she had found exactly what she was looking for when she boarded that train in Boston all those years ago. Not security or a practical arrangement, but love, real and deep and lasting, with a man who had seen her at her worst and called her a queen, who had spent a lifetime proving that he meant every word. The West had tested them both, had thrown obstacles and hardships and challenges at them year after year, but they had faced everything together and emerged stronger for it. The 6 Points Ranch thrived, Their children were happy and successful. Their grandchildren carried forward the best of what James and Catherine had built together. It was more than either of them had dared dream that day in Redemption Springs, when James had walked into a church and changed the course of Catherine's life forever. As the years continued to unfold, Catherine and James grew old together gracefully, supported by their family and secure in their love for each other. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1923 with a party that brought together multiple generations. Friends and neighbors from across the territory now turned state, everyone wanting to honor a couple whose love story had become legendary in the region. James died peacefully in his sleep in 1925 at the age of 71, and Catherine was beside him when he drew his last breath, holding his hand just as she had held it countless times throughout their life together. She grieved deeply but without bitterness, grateful for every moment they had shared, every memory they had created, every challenge they had overcome side by side. Catherine lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, passing down stories and wisdom and love to each new generation. She told them about the day she arrived in the territory covered in dust, about the cowboy who had looked at her and seen a queen, about the life they had built together through hard work and determination, and love that never wavered. When James Cordell died in 1930 at the age of 69, she was laid to rest beside James on a hill overlooking the 6 Points Ranch, under the vast Arizona sky they had both loved so much. Her children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye to a woman who had shaped all their lives, who had shown them through her example what it meant to live with courage and integrity and love. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management and later under his son James, the legacy passing down through generations just as Catherine and James had always hoped. The story of how they met, of the mail-order bride who refused to marry the wrong man and the cowboy who saw her worth when she was covered head to toe in dust, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of true love and the courage to choose the right path, even when it was difficult. The necklace James had given Catherine on her 50th birthday was passed down to Margaret, who wore it on her wedding day and then passed it to her eldest daughter, who wore it on her wedding day, the tradition continuing through the years, each woman who wore it remembering the love story that had made it possible for them to exist, the unexpected romance that had bloomed in the harsh Arizona territory between a frightened bride and a compassionate cowboy. The West had shaped Catherine Brennan into James Cordell, had tested her and strengthened her, and given her opportunities she never would have had if she had stayed in Boston. James Cordell had seen her potential from the very beginning, had loved her without reservation, had spent his life proving that love through actions as well as words. And together, they had created something remarkable, a legacy of love and family and hard work that endured long after they were gone. The dusty young woman who stepped off the stagecoach in 1883 had indeed worn the West like a queen, just as James had said she would. And in doing so she had built a kingdom of love and family that would stand the test of time, a testament to the power of courage and compassion, and the unexpected gift of finding true love in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their story became more than just family legend. It became part of the larger story of the West itself, of people who came seeking new lives and found more than they ever imagined, of courage and perseverance, and love strong enough to overcome any obstacle. Catherine and James Cordell had lived fully and loved deeply, and their legacy would continue as long as there were descendants to remember them and tell their story. A story that began with dust and destiny, and a cowboy who saw a queen where others might have seen only a tired, dirty traveler at the end of a long journey. The 6 Points Ranch stood as their monument, the land they had loved and worked and built upon, the home they had created together, the legacy they had left for future generations. And on quiet evenings when the sun set over the desert, turning the sky gold and purple and deep blue, those who loved the ranch and knew its history could almost hear the echo of Catherine's laugh and James's voice, could almost see them sitting together on the porch watching the stars emerge, hands clasped, hearts joined. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would endure long after they had gone. The West had been conquered not by violence or domination, but by love and hard work, and the determination of people like Catherine and James, who saw potential where others saw only hardship, who built communities and families and legacies that would shape the region for generations to come. Their story was one small thread in the larger tapestry of Western history, but it was a thread of gold, shining bright, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures come not from seeking glory, but from having the courage to choose love even when it is unexpected and inconvenient and completely unplanned. Catherine Brennan had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger and found instead her soulmate, her partner, her great love. James Cordell had looked at a dust-covered woman and seen a queen, then spent his life treating her like royalty while she transformed his ranch into a home and his dreams into reality. Together they had proven that love could bloom even in the harsh desert, that courage and kindness could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the greatest gift life can offer is the unexpected chance to choose a different path, one that leads to happiness beyond imagining. Their love story ended as all love stories must, with death separating what life had joined together. But the love itself never ended, living on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the ranch that bore their mark, in the community they had helped build, in the memories of all who had known them and been touched by their example. Catherine and James Cordell had lived and loved and left the world better than they found it, and in the end, that was the truest measure of a life well lived, a love well honored, a legacy well earned. The mail-order bride who had arrived covered in dust had indeed worn the West like a queen, and the cowboy who had seen her glory had spent his life ensuring she knew her worth. Together they had written a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered and cherished as long as there were people who believed in the power of love to transform lives and create miracles in the most unlikely of places, under the vast western sky where anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it.